The Supreme Court has delivered a landmark decision, striking down the broad tariffs imposed during the Trump administration and reasserting Congress's constitutional authority over international commerce. This ruling marks a decisive end to a period of American economic nationalism that disrupted global supply chains and strained alliances. The court's intervention signals a return to a more predictable, rules-based global trading order. By invalidating billions in contested tariffs, the decision could lower prices for American consumers and ease burdens on manufacturers. The ruling forces a national debate on the balance of power in trade policy, shifting the focus from executive action to legislative oversight. It's not just about economics, it's about the character of American leadership and the rule of law in the 21st century. The Supreme Court has placed a significant obstacle in the path of unilateral executive protectionism. This judgment opens a new era of American trade policy, where the rule of law, not executive whim, is the guiding principle. The Trump tariffs were the fulfillment of a central campaign promise to revive American manufacturing. Starting in 2018, the administration imposed sweeping tariffs on solar panels, washing machines, steel, and aluminum, justified under national security grounds. The scope quickly expanded, targeting China with tariffs on over $350 billion in goods, sparking a tit-for-tat trade war. China retaliated, especially against U.S. agricultural exports, escalating tensions and rattling global markets. The economic impact was immediate. While some U.S. industries benefited, most manufacturers and consumers faced higher costs and reduced competitiveness. The national security rationale was controversial, as many targeted countries were close U.S. allies. This strained diplomatic relations and led to retaliatory tariffs on iconic American products. The broad use of national security became the legal vulnerability at the heart of the policy. Ultimately, a coalition of importers and businesses challenged the executive's authority, setting the stage for the Supreme Court's intervention. The court's decision now closes this contentious chapter in U.S. trade history. The legal battle was about more than tariffs. It was about the limits of presidential power. The legal fight began soon after the 2018 tariffs, when steel importers sued in the U.S. Court of International Trade. They argued that Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act gave the president unchecked power over commerce, violating the Constitution. Lower courts sided with the government, citing procedural safeguards in the law. Undeterred, the challengers appealed, insisting the statute lacked clear limits and allowed the president to bypass Congress. The Supreme Court's decision to hear the case in 2024 signaled a willingness to revisit the boundaries of executive power in trade. The case's journey through specialized courts highlighted the complexity of challenging presidential authority in this arena. The plaintiffs weren't just fighting tariffs, they were contesting decades of expanding executive power. Their persistence brought the issue to the nation's highest court. The stage was set for a landmark ruling on the separation of powers in trade policy. At the Supreme Court, the core issue was the constitutional balance between Congress and the president. The steel importers argued that Section 232 gave the president nearly unlimited power to impose tariffs. With national security defined so broadly, it became meaningless. They warned this allowed the executive to bypass Congress and pursue protectionist goals under a flimsy pretext. The government countered that the law included procedural checks and that the president needed flexibility to respond to real threats. They argued that the president's expertise and access to sensitive information justified broad discretion in trade matters. The government also cautioned that striking down the law would weaken the president's ability to act swiftly in genuine crises. The justices pressed both sides on the limits of executive power and the need for clear legislative guidance. The arguments crystallized a fundamental question: how much authority can Congress delegate to the president in matters of trade and national security? The court's decision would set a precedent for the future of American trade policy. On September 2, 2025, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Section 232, as applied, was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power. The court didn't strike down the law entirely, but rejected the boundless use of national security to justify broad tariffs. The ruling voided the steel and aluminum tariffs, opening the door for importers to seek refunds. More importantly, it revived the non-delegation doctrine, setting a higher bar for future executive actions in trade. The decision drew a clear line. Economic policy goals cannot be pursued through unilateral executive action under the guise of national security. The justices emphasized that Congress, not the president, holds the primary authority to regulate foreign commerce. The verdict reasserted the separation of powers and sent a strong message to both the White House and Congress. The Supreme Court's decision triggered an immediate reaction in financial markets. Stocks surged for companies reliant on steel and aluminum, while domestic producers saw sharp declines. The ruling was widely seen as a de-escalation of trade tensions and a boost for global supply chains. International markets responded positively, with U.S. trading partners' currencies strengthening. Business leaders and foreign governments welcomed the return to rules-based trade, though they acknowledged the damage from years of tariffs. For U.S. steel and aluminum producers, the loss of protection means a tough adjustment ahead and renewed lobbying for targeted support from Congress. Economists predict a modest but positive impact on inflation, as lower input costs ripple through the economy. The decision gives the Federal Reserve more flexibility in managing monetary policy. The broader effect, a shift from executive-driven trade policy to a more stable, legislative process. The fallout underscores the far-reaching consequences of the court's ruling for both the U.S. and global economies. This decision joins a select group of Supreme Court cases that have checked presidential power in times of crisis. The most notable parallel is the 1952 Youngstown Steel case, where the court blocked President Truman from seizing steel mills during the Korean War. Justice Jackson's famous framework from that case, presidential power is strongest with Congress's support, weakest when acting against it, guided the court's thinking here. The Trump tariffs, justified as national security, were found to be primarily domestic economic measures, encroaching on Congress's authority. The court's ruling places broad unilateral tariffs in the category of executive overreach. The revival of the non-delegation doctrine echoes 1930s cases like Schechter Poultry, where the court struck down laws that gave the executive too much legislative power. The decision signals that the judiciary will intervene when the president uses foreign policy tools for domestic economic aims. Historically, the court has been more protective of Congress's role in the domestic economy than in foreign affairs. The Trump tariffs blurred this line, prompting a rare and forceful judicial check. The ruling reaffirms the constitutional boundaries between the branches of government. It's a reminder that even in times of crisis, the separation of powers remains fundamental. The Supreme Court's decision fundamentally shifts power over trade policy back to Congress. Future trade laws will likely be more specific, with tighter definitions and limits on executive authority. The era of presidents unilaterally imposing sweeping tariffs is over. Consensus building between Congress and the White House will be essential. For America's trading partners, this means more stability and predictability in U.S. trade policy. The ruling strengthens the U.S. position in international institutions like the WTO, restoring credibility to its advocacy for rules-based trade. However, the political appetite for protectionism remains, and new legislative battles over targeted tariffs and trade barriers are likely. The debate over balancing free trade, national security, and domestic interests will continue in Congress. The court clarified the constitutional process, but the underlying political and economic tensions persist. The future of U.S. trade policy will be shaped by this new, more deliberative framework. By curtailing the executive's use of national security as a pretext for protectionism, the Supreme Court has reset America's approach to global trade. The decision affirms Congress's primary role in regulating foreign commerce and restores the rule of law to trade policy. Consumers and industries that rely on imports stand to benefit from lower costs and greater stability. Internationally, the ruling is seen as a step toward restoring trust in the U.S. as a champion of rules-based trade. The decision revives the non-delegation doctrine, reinforcing limits on presidential power. Congress now faces the challenge of crafting trade policy that balances free trade, fair competition, and national interest. The world is watching to see if the U.S. can lead a new era of global trade reform. The fundamental question remains, can America champion a renewed vision for open, rules-based trade in an era of rising nationalism?